Nobody in the village of Ashkara could fully explain Will. They tried, of course. People always try. They said he was quiet, and that was true. They said he had a look in his eyes like someone listening to a sound that other people could not hear. That was also true. Some of the older residents said he had always been that way, even as a small boy, sitting by the river with his feet in the cold water, watching the surface as though he expected something to rise from it. But none of those explanations covered everything. They did not explain why candles went still when Will walked into a room, the flame pausing for just a moment before resuming its flicker. They did not explain why animals followed him along roads, not with the frantic excitement of hunger but with something closer to respect. And they certainly did not explain why the Magia Vander Mages, the most respected order in the entire region, treated Will with a mixture of warmth and careful distance, the way people treat someone they deeply admire but do not fully understand. Will was 32 years old, and he had been a practicing mage since the age of 14. He was good at the craft. Very good, actually. He could weave the Vander spells with a precision that took most mages decades to develop. He could feel the living threads of the world's energy the way a musician feels rhythm, naturally, without effort, without having to count the beats. His teachers had praised him. His fellow mages respected him. And yet there was always something unsaid in every room he entered, a subject that everyone seemed to agree to leave alone. Will noticed. He had always noticed. He simply did not know which question to ask. On a Thursday evening in late autumn, the Magia Vander Mages gathered at their meeting hall, a wide stone building on the edge of Ashkara, surrounded by old oak trees whose roots had long since grown through the floor tiles. The hall always smelled of cedar and something sharper, something electric, the scent of craft being practiced by many people over many years. Will arrived on time, as he always did. He greeted the others, took his seat in the circle, and began the opening ritual alongside everyone else. The words came easily. They always came easily. What was harder, what had always been harder, was the feeling that accompanied the words. The feeling of speaking in a language that was not quite his mother tongue. Close, very close, but off by a fraction that he could never quite measure. He was still puzzling over this feeling when Saran walked in. Saran was one of Will's closest friends in the order. He had been away for 3 weeks, assigned to a distant village where strange things had been reported, objects moving on their own, voices speaking from empty rooms, livestock refusing to enter their shelters. Ordinary assignments for mages. Saran was experienced, careful, and cheerful by nature. He was the sort of person who could defuse tension with a single well-placed joke. But the man who walked through the door that evening was not cheerful. He was not tense, either. He was blank. His eyes, which were usually warm and quick to find humor in everything, were flat. His movements were too smooth, too even, like a person walking in a dream. He sat down in his usual chair, folded his hands in his lap, and said nothing. The ritual continued. But Will watched Saran throughout, and what he saw made the hair on the back of his neck rise. When Saran spoke the traditional Vander words, his mouth moved correctly, his pronunciation was perfect, but the energy that should have accompanied the words was absent. It was like watching someone mime playing a piano without touching the keys. The motion was right. The music was not there. After the gathering ended, Will caught up with Saran outside in the cool night air. "Are you well?" Will asked. Saran turned to look at him. There was a pause that was exactly 1 second too long. Then Saran smiled. "Of course," he said. "Just tired from the travel." The smile reached his mouth perfectly. It did not reach his eyes at all. Will walked home slowly that night, and he did not sleep well. Over the next 2 days, he watched Saran quietly. He did not raise an alarm. He did not want to be wrong. He paid attention to details, how Saran held his cup of tea, which direction he faced when he thought no one was looking, whether he laughed at the same things he used to laugh at. The answer to all of these observations was the same. Saran was performing Saran. Underneath the performance, something was missing. Will had heard stories about this, every mage had. They were told as cautionary tales, passed down through the order's history. Baal was the name given to the force that could hollow a person out from the inside, taking up residence in the empty space left behind. Baal was not a demon in the simple sense that old stories described. He was something older, something that operated through patience rather than force, through erosion rather than assault. He moved into people slowly, the way water moves into cracked stone in winter, and by the time the crack was visible, the damage inside was already extensive. Most mages spoke of Baal as a historical threat. Something that had caused great harm centuries ago but was no longer actively present. A warning from the past, useful for teaching students the importance of protecting their inner life. Will was no longer certain that reading was correct. He went to Elder Kova. Kova was the oldest member of the order, a small, sharp-eyed woman who wore her gray hair in a braid and spoke in short sentences that contained more information than most people's paragraphs. She had been a mage for over 50 years. She kept an archive in the back room of the meeting hall, thousands of documents, records of cases, historical accounts, maps of energy fields, and carefully preserved descriptions of every unusual event the order had encountered in living memory. Will told her what he had observed in Saran. He was precise and careful, because he knew Kova valued precision above almost everything else. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You have done well to notice," she said at last. "Leave it with me." "Is it Baal?" Will asked directly. Another pause. Longer than it needed to be. "Leave it with me," she said again. She was hiding something. Will was certain of it. He had known Kova for 18 years, and in all that time she had never hesitated before answering a direct question. The hesitation was its own kind of answer. That night, he returned to the hall after the last light in Kova's window had gone dark. He was not proud of what he did next. He entered through the side door, mages were always given access to the building, made his way to the archive room, and lit a small lamp. He searched for his own name. It took nearly an hour. The records were organized by date and subject, not by name, and Kova's handwriting was small and precise. But he found it eventually. A sealed folder, tucked between two larger volumes, labeled only with a reference number. Inside was a single page. On it, written in a hand he did not recognize, were three things: his full name, a date 15 years before the current day, and a symbol, a circular mark made of intertwining lines, that he had never seen before but which his hand, when he reached out to trace it, seemed to recognize on its own. He was still staring at the page when the lamp in the doorway brightened, and Kova walked in. She was not angry. That was the first thing he noticed. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something close to relief. "Sit down, Will," she said. He sat. She closed the door, pulled a chair across from him, and sat as well. She did not take the folder from him. "I have been waiting for the right moment to tell you this for a very long time," she said. "I have told myself, again and again, that the moment had not yet arrived. I was wrong to wait as long as I did. I am sorry for that." Will held the folder and said nothing. "You are not Magia Vander by initiation only," Kova began. "You are Magia Vander by blood. You are the direct living descendant of Aldera Vander herself." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into deep water. Aldera Vander was not simply the founder of the order. She was, according to the oldest records, the first human being to weave the Vander craft into the world, to take the living energy that moved through everything and give it a language, a shape, a set of principles by which it could be used with intention. The mages called her the First Light. They spoke her name only in the context of deep respect. She was not a saint or a goddess in the religious sense, but she was understood to be something beyond ordinary human measure. She did not die in the way the histories describe, Kova continued. She transformed. She poured the deepest part of her gift into a hidden bloodline, a single thread of inheritance, passed down through generations, protected and concealed so that Baal could never reach it. That bloodline ends with you. You are the living container of Aldera's original fire. Will's mouth was dry. And Baal knows this. Baal has always known, Kova said. What you observed in Saran, that is not coincidence. Baal's current activity is not random. He is moving through the order to reach you. He wants to find you before you find yourself. Because once you know who you are, once you step fully into what you carry, he cannot touch you. Will looked at the circular symbol on the page in front of him. His hand was still resting on it. "This mark," he said. "It is Aldera's seal. It appears on the record of your binding, the moment, 15 years ago, when the bloodline in you became active. You were not aware of it. Most of the mages were. We have been watching over you since then. Watching over me, Will repeated. And not telling me. Kova met his eyes. We were afraid that naming it too early would draw Baal before you were ready. That was our judgment. As I said, I believe we waited too long. Will stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark oak trees. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, quietly, tell me everything you know about Baal's methods. Kova told him everything. They talked through the rest of the night. By morning, Will understood the shape of what was happening. Baal moved through erosion. He found the small uncertainties inside a person, the places where identity was thin or unsure, and he worked at those places the way wind works at the edge of a cliff. Over time, the cliff face retreats. The person remains outwardly themselves but becomes inwardly available, a space that can be occupied. Saran's 3 weeks in the distant village had provided exactly that kind of exposure. Whatever had happened there had left him tired, uncertain, and temporarily unguarded. That was all Baal needed. The following evening, at the regular gathering of the order, Baal made his presence clear. It did not begin loudly. It almost never does. Saran sat in his usual chair. 2 other mages, an older woman named Drath and a young man named Fielding, sat in theirs. And then, at a moment between one ritual phrase and the next, all 3 of them went completely still. The other mages noticed. The room went quiet. Then Saran spoke, and the voice that came out of him was his own voice in pitch and volume but wrong in every other way. The words were the Vander phrases, but they were running backward, inverted, like a reflection in water that has been disturbed. Drath and Fielding spoke at the same time, the same inverted words, and the energy in the room shifted in a way that Will felt in his chest like a cold hand pressing inward. Several mages moved toward the exits. 2 of the older members attempted counterspells. Neither worked. The inverted energy simply absorbed the efforts the way deep water absorbs a thrown stone, with a ripple and then nothing. Will did not move toward the exit. He stood in the center of the room and felt something change in his chest. Not an emotion, exactly. More like a decision being made below the level of thought, in a place that had been waiting for this moment. The borrowed feeling, the sense of words that were almost his, dissolved. What replaced it was not grand or dramatic. It was simply accurate. He felt, for the first time in his life, exactly like himself. He began to speak. The words he spoke were not from any Vander text he had been taught. They came from somewhere else, the same somewhere that his hand had known the symbol in the archive, the same place that had always made candles go still when he entered a room. They were quiet words, and they were in a language older than anything the order currently practiced, but every mage in that room understood them in the way that people understand music even when they do not know the words of the song. The inverted energy slowed. Then it stopped. Then it began, carefully, slowly, to reverse. What followed was not a confrontation in any physical sense. It was more like an argument between 2 truths, with Will holding one side of it and Baal holding the other. Baal's truth was the truth of emptiness, that all identity is temporary, all power is borrowed, all warmth eventually goes cold. He communicated this not in words but in the quality of the air in the room, in the flatness behind Saran's eyes, in the way the candles flickered. It was a persuasive truth in its way. It was not entirely wrong. Will's truth was simpler and harder to argue with. It was the truth of Saran's actual face, the lines around his eyes when he laughed, the way he always refilled other people's cups before his own, the specific color of his voice when he was genuinely moved by something. Real things. Particular things. Things that had no inverted version because they were too specific to be turned around. Will walked toward Saran slowly. He placed both hands on Saran's shoulders and held them firmly. He said Saran's name, not as a spell, not as a ritual phrase, just as the name of a person he knew well and valued deeply. He felt the resistance. It was real and it was strong, pressing back against his hands like a current in deep water. He held steady. He kept his hands where they were and kept saying Saran's name, and he drew on the thing in his chest, Aldera's fire, the inherited warmth that had been waiting 18 years for a situation that required it, and he let it move through his hands into the space that Baal had occupied. Light does not need to fight darkness. It simply needs to be present. When it is present, the darkness is not destroyed, it simply no longer has a place to stand. Saran blinked. He blinked again, slowly. He looked at his own hands as though seeing them for the first time in weeks. Then he looked at Will, and his eyes, his actual eyes, warm and quick and full of recognition, came back into focus. "Will," he said. His voice was rough. "Will, I know," Will said. "It's all right." He moved to Drath next, then to Fielding. Each cleansing took a different shape because each person had been reached through a different weakness, and restoration required moving through the same door that the erosion had used. It was slow work. By the time he finished with Fielding, Will's hands were trembling and the room felt very far away. But Baal had not left. Will felt that clearly. The three people were free, but the presence behind them remained, patient, attentive, and now, for the first time, directly focused on Will. The room's remaining mages stood still, watching. Kova stood at the far edge of the circle with her hands folded and an expression that was calm because she had made it calm, not because she felt it. Baal communicated in the way he always communicated, not in words, but in feeling. What Will received was a question wrapped in a sensation. The sensation was of finally being seen. The question was whether Will was ready to stop carrying a fire that was not his and simply use the one that was. It was a clever offer. Will recognized that immediately. It was built from real material, the years of borrowed feeling, the uncertainty, the longing to be fully himself rather than a careful steward of someone else's inheritance. Baal had been watching him long enough to know exactly where the offer would land. Will sat with it for a moment. He did not dismiss it instantly, because dismissing it instantly would have been a kind of dishonesty. He let himself feel the weight of those years. The long years of almost. The long patience of waiting to be something clear. Then he thought about what it had felt like to hold Saran's shoulders. To feel the resistance and stay anyway. To be spent, genuinely spent, burned through, in the act of bringing someone back to themselves. He turned his attention toward Baal's presence directly. "You built your entire plan," Will said, aloud, in the quiet room, around the idea that I would rather keep myself than give myself. "That is what you do not understand about what I am." The presence shifted. It was subtle, just a change in the quality of the air, but Will felt it clearly. Uncertainty. Not fear, but something that in a person would have looked like confusion. Aldera did not hoard the fire, Will continued. She poured it out. She put it into a bloodline and let it travel through generations of ordinary human lives. She trusted it to people who did not know they were carrying it. That is not how a miser thinks. That is how a gardener thinks. He spread his hands. "I will not be using this for myself," he said. "So your offer has nothing to offer me." What happened next would be described differently by every mage who witnessed it. Some said the room grew very bright. Some said it became very warm. Saran, who was perhaps best placed to describe it having just returned from the inside of Baal's erosion, said it felt like a door slamming shut in a house that had been letting in cold wind for a very long time. The slam was final. The silence after it was the silence of sealed warmth. Will used everything. He drew on every thread of Aldera's inheritance that ran through him, pulled it to the surface without hesitation, and used it to close every entry point that Baal had opened in the order, not just the three people in the room, but every small crack, every thin place, every almost invisible point of erosion that Baal had been quietly working on throughout the Magia Vander order for years. He sealed them all. One by one and then together, the way a net is drawn closed. It was the most complete thing he had ever done. It was also the most expensive. When he finished, he was so tired that he sat down on the floor of the meeting hall because his legs had simply made the decision without consulting him. Kova came and sat beside him on the floor. This was remarkable in itself, Kova, who maintained her dignity in all circumstances, sitting on the cold stone floor of the hall. She did not say anything. She simply sat there, which was exactly what the moment needed. In the days that followed, the Magia Vander Mages did something that required more courage than the events of that evening. They had honest conversations. They talked about the years of concealment around Will's identity, and whether that concealment had been the right choice. They talked about the mages who had been touched by Baal's erosion, and how to support their recovery. They talked about what they now understood about themselves, that the Order had developed blind spots, comfortable assumptions, and a tendency to mistake the absence of obvious problems for genuine safety. Will was part of these conversations. He was not at the center of them, which was exactly right. The order did not need a leader. It needed to think carefully, together, about what came next. Kova offered him a formal leadership role. He declined, graciously and firmly. What I am is not a title, he explained. It is a function. Aldera's gift does not make me the head of anything. It makes me available for specific moments. Those moments will come when they come. In between, I would like to simply be a member of this order, one who has finally stopped feeling borrowed. Kova looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. That, she said, is a very Aldera thing to say. Will laughed. It was the first time in days that he had laughed, and it felt clean. Saran found him afterward, sitting outside under the oak trees whose roots had grown through the floor tiles. The evening was cold and clear. The stars were out. I remember all of it, Saran said, sitting down beside him. The weeks away. And after. I was present for it, Will. I could see and hear everything. I just could not make myself act like myself. I know, Will said. How did you know to do what you did? How did you know those words? Will thought about it carefully. I did not know them in the way you know something you have been taught, he said. I knew them the way you know your own name. The way you know it is morning when the light changes. Not learned. Just, always there. Saran nodded slowly. They sat together in silence for a while, which was comfortable in the way that silence between old friends can be. Are you afraid? Saran asked eventually. Of what comes next? Will considered the question with the same care he gave to everything. The stars were very still above them. The oak trees moved slightly in the wind, their old roots pressing against stone, patient and permanent. No, he said. And then, because it was true, I was afraid for a long time. I was afraid of the borrowed feeling. Afraid that if I looked too closely at myself I would find something missing, some gap that explained why I never quite fit. He paused. What I found instead, he continued, was something I had been carrying since before I had words for it. Something old and warm and mine. Genuinely mine. He rested his back against the oak tree. Being afraid of that seems like a waste of time now. The candles in the meeting hall behind them burned steadily. For the first time in living memory, not one of them flickered when Will walked past. There was no longer any reason for them to pause and take notice. He was simply one of them now, present, warm, giving light without effort or interruption. That was enough. In fact, for the first time in his life, it was exactly enough.